Hey folks, in the last couple videos I replaced the front suspension in the Basket Case BMW. Now we're moving on back to the rear suspension. In this video, the crusty old rear suspension is coming out. I took a couple shortcuts to make the job go easier, and I'm going to walk you through it. First of all, notice how the front of the car is up on ramps. We need to have the entire car lifted up because I need access to the exhaust system and the drive shaft. Speaking of the exhaust, that's the first thing we're going to remove. I put my floor jack under the midpoint of the exhaust system. Then I removed all the mounting bolts and used the jack to lower it down. Then I rolled the whole thing out from under the car. Next, we're going to remove the heat shield in the drive shaft tunnel. It's a big piece, but it weighs almost nothing. It's made of thin aluminum sheet. The whole thing is held in place by 4 bolts. We also need to remove a small heat shield next to the differential. It has 2 bolts. Since we're under there, this is a good time to detach the drive shaft from the rear differential. I could only access half of the bolts, so I put the transmission in neutral and turned the drive shaft by hand to get at the other bolts. Then I put it back in park to hold the drive shaft while I remove them. At this point, I decided to remove the rear sway bar. I'm not sure if it was necessary, but I felt like it would give me more room to work. It's pretty straightforward. Each end link has 2 bolts, and each mounting bracket has 1 bolt. Next, I'm going to detach the CV axles from the rear differential. I'm doing that now so I can use the parking brake to hold them while I remove the bolts. And just like the drive shaft, I could only access some of the bolts. So I had to disengage the parking brake, rotate the axles by hand, then reapply the parking brake to hold it in place while I remove the bolts. Next, I'm going to remove the wheel speed sensors. There are 2 ways to go about this. You could leave the sensors installed in the hubs and just unplug them, or you could remove them from the hubs. I decided to do the latter because the electrical plugs are deteriorating and I don't want to touch them. And here in Florida, we don't salt the roads, so I don't have to worry about the sensors getting rusted into the hubs. Ah, look at this gooey black residue inside the wheel well. I wonder where that came from. Anyway, back to work. I don't want to open up the brake hydraulic system, so I'm going to use a shortcut to keep the calipers attached to the brake lines. Here's how that works. First, I need to detach the bottom of the shock absorber from the hub. I put a jack under the hub so nothing crazy happens when the shock is detached. Now I'm going to break loose the bolts that attach the caliper bracket to the hub. I'm doing that now while the hub is still attached to the suspension. If you wait until later, the hub is going to be flopping around. We're not going to remove those bolts yet, just break them loose. While we're in there, we also need to detach the brake line from that mounting bracket. Next, we'll detach the camber arm from the hub. That bolt might need a little persuasion to come out. With the shock absorber and the camber arm detached from the hub, you now have room to remove the brakes. So let's remove those caliper bracket bolts, and we can remove the caliper, the brake pads, and the mounting bracket as a unit. You can finagle the brake line through the space you just made by detaching those suspension components. And now we can set aside the brake caliper. This is also a good time to remove the brake rotor. I also figured this was a good time to remove the suspension springs. At this point, they're basically just sitting loose. Simple enough. Next, we're going to detach the trailing arms from the chassis. Each trailing arm has 3 bolts. This is pretty straightforward. Just keep in mind when you detach it, it's going to fall down. Taking a trailing arm to the face will probably suck. At this point, the suspension is disconnected from the chassis. The subframe is almost ready to come out. But first, we need to detach the parking brake cables. They run through the subframe and up into the cabin to the parking brake lever. You'll have to detach the cables from the parking brake lever, then pull them out. The cables run alongside the driveshaft, so you'll have to get under there and pull the cables out from the chassis. Then you'll have to pull them out of the subframe as well. Here you can see where it goes through the subframe between the upper and lower control arm. You'll have to pull the cable all the way out. Last but not least, we need to remove this aluminum brace in front of the differential. It has 4 small bolts that attach it to the chassis. Those 2 big nuts are actually the fasteners for the front of the subframe. So after you remove this piece, there will be only 2 bolts holding up the subframe. As I was getting ready to drop the subframe, I saw the shocks hanging down and thought they might get in the way. So I decided to remove them. To be honest, I probably could have removed them earlier. Okay, let's drop that subframe. Hey, my plan actually worked. I was able to drop the subframe, the rear differential, and most of the suspension as a unit. Plus I was able to keep the brake hydraulic system sealed up. That's what I call a win-win. Check out these wasp nests. These things are huge. Thankfully there's no wasps in there. There were a bunch of these things all over the car. It makes me wonder if the car sat for a long time before I bought it. Anyway, this is a great opportunity to power wash the undercarriage. It's pretty grungy in there, so I hosed it down with super clean foaming degreaser. I let it soak in for about 10 minutes, then I went after it with the power washer. My electric power washer isn't strong enough to damage hoses or cables unless you really try. But it's powerful enough to remove loose dirt and grime. Now I have easy access to the subframe mounting points, so I can inspect them for damage and install those reinforcing plates. But we'll do that in the next video. Thanks for watching.